Welcome back, everyone. We're now ready for our third session of the day on access to higher education. Jane Gatewood will be moderating. Over to you, Jane. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed your wonderful lunch. I'm Jane Gatewood. I serve as Vice Provost for Global Engagement at the University of Rochester, and we have our session now on access to higher education. And I'll be inviting 4 speakers to talk with us about various aspects of this. To give a little context going in, I thought I would give you some figures on global higher education. In 2000, there were 100 million university students. UNESCO projects that by 2040, there will be 600 million. So you can do the math on that. That's a 500% increase in 40 years. In 2020, there were 250 million. So just from 2020 to 2040, massive increase. These demands for higher education are going to come from the global south, and most of higher education institutions are in the global north. So there's a lot of challenges to the sector, a lot of opportunities to the sector worldwide. I'd like to invite me to not shuffle my papers. I'd like to invite Andrew Parfit to come speak. He is Vice Chancellor and President of the University of Technology, Sydney. Professor Parfit is the Vice Chancellor and President of the University of Technology, Sydney. He joined UTS in February 2017 as the university's Provost and Senior Vice President. Previously, Andrew was Deputy Vice Chancellor Academic at the University of Newcastle in Australia. He has also held positions at the University of South Australia, the University of Adelaide, and CISRO, the National Science Agency of Australia. He is a senior member of IEEE and a Fellow of Engineers Australia. He's previously held adjunct academic appointments at Adelaide, Sydney, and Monterey universities. Welcome, Andrew. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you for all the brave people who have stayed on after lunch. It's good to see you here. These are really important topics, and it's really important to engage with them from the context in which we come, because we can learn from one another. We can certainly share ideas, but some of the solutions we put in place may be different. When we speak in Australia, we normally acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're on. So I would like to acknowledge from the land of my campus, and I'll come back to why later on, who are the Gatewood people of the Eora Nation, and pay respects to their elders past and present, and also acknowledge that Indigenous people in Australia never ceded their land. We have never had a treaty, and we have a long way to go before we have equitable outcomes between the general Australian population and our Indigenous colleagues. Now, I will come back to that later on, but I'll start with the general statement. Australia's a lucky country in many ways. We're highly developed, we've got a good economy, mostly, lots of resources, stable government, very solid democracy. You would think that we would have all the advantages, yet we're 30th out of 38 countries for educational advantage and equity in the OECD. So right down the bottom. And then if you look at factors like whatever you think of systematic testing of educational outcomes, over the past period of time, 3-5 years, what we've seen is at the bottom of that educational testing, the outcomes have been diminishing significantly by 50%, and at the top they continue to hold. So inequity exists, and it's getting wider. And that's why I think some of the conversations that universities have to play in this are really important. But it does actually get even worse in many ways, because if inequity exists through the education system, it exists in the output as well. So if you look at things like earnings over a lifetime, people who graduated from university earn in Australia around 50% more than people who don't graduate from university. So that continues to perpetuate the inequity. People who have more. The first in family factor comes in, so unless you've been exposed to people who go to university, you don't tend to want to go to university. So the wealth shift is very apparent, the inequity widens. When the former Labor government in Australia introduced the demand-driven system back about 10 years ago, that was really opening up education to anyone who was qualified in Australia to take an undergraduate degree, whereas previously we had quotas. Now we're back at being capped again, but in the meantime we grew enormously as a sector. And in the early manifestation of that demand-driven system, the government put in place targets about how many graduates it thought Australia needed to have a sustainable modern economy. And it also put in place targets to overcome some of those inequities. It identified that low socioeconomic standard students were less likely to go to university, and put funding behind it as well, put schemes that were allocated to universities on the basis of their performance in that area in widening participation for low socioeconomic students, with the recognition that universities had to put the effort in to ensure that those students succeed. We have an obligation not just to admit students, but to make a good judgment, academically and otherwise, that they can succeed in their studies. In Australia, students take on a debt. It is income contingent repayment, so students, when they enter, don't think about it, but as soon as they're paying tax, they do. So there is a cost of education that's associated with that, so we have obligations there. So those support funds have diminished. There is no target, it disappeared, and the work's left undone. And my reflection is why? It's because it's hard. All of those factors work against low socioeconomic students, students who've not been exposed to the benefits of higher education, people with other forms of disadvantage, just find the barriers high. So the system didn't work for them. And what I come to here is some points I want to make around what institutions then have to do before reflecting on what the network might think is something that could be helpful in that regard. Recognising again that we all have a different context, whether in Canada, UK, Africa, wherever you are, you have a different context, so the same solutions are not going to be in place. So just turning first of all to admission, fundamentally we admit to university on academic merit. We do lots of things around that, but fundamentally we make an assessment of students on their academic achievements and offer places at university in that regard. And yet the backgrounds that students come from have a significant effect on their academic attainment. In New South Wales, the state where my university exists, half of the schools are actually in regional areas with very substantially differential in the resources that are applied to education. So what a surprise that the outcomes are actually different from a well-resourced inner city school to a regional school. So it's less the regionality that counts as where the resources are placed that create the barrier. And if you think about it, you can actually correct for that sort of thing. So you can actually say that if you want to rank students academically, and we have a process for doing that, I'm sure we've all got processes that we use to do that, if you recognise that there is a resource impact of regional schools compared to metropolitan schools, then you can, we call it an adjustment factor, I think we used to call it bonus points, that's a bit diminishing of it, but it's an adjustment that says the performance in the region, by virtue not of the student's ability, but by virtue of the resources that are applied to the education, is differential, and therefore we can correct for it. So we can go around those sorts of things and try to put in place approaches by which we overcome some of the inequity. So let me talk about three areas, just to sort of put some thoughts on the table around what that might look like. And the first one is particularly important for my university as a university of technology, is the participation of women in STEM disciplines. So it varies across the STEM disciplines. When I was an Associate Dean of Engineering 30 years ago, I know I don't look that old, but 30 years ago I was an Associate Dean of Engineering. The proportion of women in engineering degrees was about 17%, 17. about 4 or 5 years ago, and we're looking again, it was about 17%. And across that entire 30 years, we put in place women in engineering programs, support processes in schools to encourage women in STEM disciplines. And we've had various successes. It's gone up and down, but not a substantial structural shift. So a few years ago at UTS, we looked at it and we thought, I wonder what we can do about this. And if you reflect on what I said about correcting the rank of academic people based on the school that they came from, you can choose to do it by gender. Because you know that the upper quartile of people, wherever they sit in the academic ranking, they are highly likely to succeed at university. They're the ones that are going to get in the academic ranking. So if you change the order a bit, the likelihood of success is still there. But the balance changes. So we said, let's add adjustment factors for women who choose to study engineering. And we actually also did construction, because that was another discipline. Horror. Diminishing the value of a degree. Diminishing people's standing in that they've got there. It was an outrage. But 30 years of work going from 17% to 17%, I think I'm prepared to cop a bit of outrage, right? Because you have to do something that is completely different, controversial to make a difference. After 3 years, and this is only a short time, we've already seen relatively small but material increases in the percentage of people entering engineering, as you would expect, because you've engineered the admission. We haven't really set a quota, but we certainly have a target for ourselves. If we can get to 30%, we absolutely know that that's self-sustaining, because a young woman in school can look at engineering and say, I can see myself there. So you've got to do things that are controversial. If the system doesn't work, individual institutions have to make choices that are challenging choices. I said I'd mention Indigenous students. Indigenous students, 3%, a bit over 3% of the Australian population is Indigenous, so we have a different context to, say, Canada or New Zealand. We have the same issue. Poor outcomes educationally, socially, health-wise, lifespan. Indigenous people in Australia do not fare well. So one of the ways in which you can improve that is by improving educational outcomes. That's a precursor for many other things. And the one closing the gap area that we've looked at that is actually closing is educational completion at schools. So if we get Indigenous students into universities, we know that there's a likelihood of them succeeding and making a difference for their families and their lives. So we take them out of that entire admission system. We'll take as many Indigenous students as want to come for us who are adequately prepared and put as much support around them as we can. And we know that it works because the success rate of our Indigenous students is nearly the same as the success rate of the overall university population. It costs a lot of money, but you have to commit to doing those sorts of things if you're going to make a difference. And now we're actually looking at implementing what we call an Indigenous residential college, where we're able to do that at scale. So we have about 1.5% of our student population is Indigenous. We need it to be at 3% for parity. So that's where we've got to get to. Last one I want to talk about is technology. University of Technology. So we all love technology, and we've seen all the educational benefits of technology through COVID. Many of us couldn't survive without technology. As soon as COVID hit, particularly with our partnerships with schools, we had students who didn't have laptops. So we had to find 300 laptops when we had thousands of people looking for laptops for disadvantaged school kids to keep their study in pathway programs. And then, of course, where do they go to connect? They can't afford broadband. We have a national broadband network, but they can't afford broadband, so they go to the library. Funny that the library was closed for COVID. So technology, equity with technology, just doesn't exist either. So somehow we have to overcome the technology advantages or the technology gap to provide the advantage and leverage the outcomes for technology. And one of the ways we are looking at doing that is I made an appointment early on in my tenure as Vice-Chancellor of a Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Social Justice and Inclusion. And her role, she's a former education minister, her role is to work with our precinct, with our business partners in our precincts, to really actually put in place early on in the development of industries, tech industries in the precincts, the mechanisms to avoid the barriers that technology causes, as well as using the leverage to make the technology work. So around my campus is a vision from the state government of a major technology centre, an innovation centre, lots of money going into it. We don't want that to be an island of privilege. We want people to be able to access it, and therefore there has to be a social obligation of people who are in that precinct to not only drive the benefits of technology but overcome the barriers as well. So 3 examples, and then I thought, well, what can the Worldwide Universities Network do? These are very local examples, right? I've got Australian Indigenous students with a particular circumstance. I've got a STEM issue in terms of participation of women in Australia. It's not replicated in every country. You wouldn't see that, for example, in a Chinese university. You'd see closer to 50-50. And then we've got still barriers of technology. So I think targets are important, is number 1. I think you have to commit to targets to make a difference, otherwise you don't get there. But each of our targets is going to be different. So my target at the moment is to get to 30% women in engineering, to get to 3% Indigenous students, to have 100% of our students actually accessing broadband. But it's the progress to the targets, I think, that could make the difference. Is there a way, and this is a question in my 46 seconds that's left, is there a way that the university network as a whole can take a stance around how we make progress towards the targets that we set for ourselves, so that we can hold ourselves mutually accountable to the investments that we make that will overcome inequity that we know exists, that has persisted in spite of many system changes to try and overcome it, but that now requires institutions to invest? That's a question for the network.
Thank you very much for those comments regarding closing the gap. Next, we have Kasturi Bahari Leek, Dean for the Center of Higher Education Development at the University of Cape Town. Kasturi, do we have you?
Hi, Jane.
Hi, welcome.
Good to be here. Thank you.
Dr. Bahari Leek is Associate Professor in the Center for Higher Education Development at UCT. As Deputy Dean Teaching and Learning, she teaches on postgraduate programs in higher education studies. As co-chair of the Curriculum Change Working Group focused on decolonization of the curriculum, she has led many engagements and has published in the field of higher education studies, decolonizing pedagogies, and decolonizing the curriculum. She is president of the Higher Education Learning and Teaching Association of Southern Africa and convenes its university staff doctoral program. She is president of the International Consortium of Education Development, and she serves on the editorial boards in higher education and is part of several national and international research consortia focused on higher education. She's going to speak with us about delinking and decoupling disciplinary practices to enable epistemic access.
Thank you very much, Jane. Thank you for that introduction. And maybe to share with you, recently I was appointed as Dean of the Faculty of Higher Education. So I've moved up 1 little rank from Deputy Dean to Dean. I'm very glad to be here to share my thoughts and scholarship on the important topic of decolonization of the curriculum as an enabler for access to higher education. I'm going to start sharing my screen now and then begin my presentation. So I'd like to say that I absolutely agree, firstly, with everything that Andrew has said in terms of the challenges, the contextual challenges that we have in trying to address the issue of access. And indeed, different universities, different countries are going to express these in different ways. I think that contextualized response to the issue of access is key. I don't think it should be an anomaly. I think it's exactly what we should do in terms of the variety of challenges that are going to come up, is to find ways to address them in situ, in the actual context of the challenge. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the curriculum as a particular lever, and what does delinking and decoupling the curriculum mean for research and for students to gain access, not just physical access, but access to the knowledge systems, to the knowledge structures that we are so involved in terms of students succeeding in higher education. So most conversations on decolonization actually start with a kind of difference in understanding the terms decolonization and decoloniality. I'm going to very quickly touch on that difference. I think it's important for understanding of what it means for curriculum. So many moves and movements towards decolonization take colonization as a departure point. And so technically, colonization or decolonization is when the structural systems of a country are now independent, and the country has control, if you like, of the material resources, etc. But decoloniality goes much deeper and further than that. It speaks to the mental attitudes, it's the values, the beliefs, the kinds of traditions and conventions that linger after a country has ended, the colonization, or the colonizers have left. So often when the system is set up in the colonial period, through schools, through churches. Are we good? Through education, many of those practices continue into the future. And so the decolonial moment is an opportunity to stand back, to reflect, to really hold up the mirror, to ask, do these practices serve us? Especially in terms of where we find ourselves in the present, but more importantly, in terms of the future that we want to imagine. Now, I think that decoloniality does hold promise in terms of unpacking, unraveling the disciplinary foci of the curriculum that we teach. Now, in the global South, from my experience, and even in the international arena, there have been many projects, programs, and efforts to work at some of the key principles of decoloniality. And often, the misnomer is that in order to decolonize, we have to throw away everything that is West and North and start from scratch, etc. And I think this is a very unnuanced way of looking at the project of decoloniality. I think it's a question of building on what has been contributed, but also recentering those countries, especially in the global South, that find themselves on the periphery and not at the center, by virtue of the colonization processes, the material resources, what funding has gone into research traditionally, what this means for marginalized voices, etc. So these are some of the topics that a decolonial curriculum would look at, as it tries to unpack and recenter. In the decolonial discourse, I think, access is thought about in non-material terms. So yes, funding and physical access, and for families that are first to universities, etc., it's very important to have those enablers. But as an academic development faculty, around, my faculty and faculties around the world that are focused on enabling students to gain access to the knowledge of the curriculum. There are many challenges in terms of looking at the content and looking at the examples that are presented in the content that are not representative of many people and many cultural groups and different indigenous knowledge systems around the world. So gaining access to the epistemologies have, up until now, meant looking at language, writing skills, reading skills, etc. But we've never really questioned what are the epistemologies in and of themselves doing to and doing for the marginalized. And so those students who do not see themselves as part of a westernized curriculum, what do knowledge structures that represent a very westernized view of the world do to students' self-esteem, to their morale, to their ability to succeed? So access to the epistemologies that are more let's say, pluralistic, that they have a wider range, mean that students are in a position to relate, to understand, to make connections, to make associations, and therefore bring their own voice into their work and insert and assert their own identities, which is very important when we talk about social justice and social inclusion. So the issue of access has to do with social access, methodological access. There are many Indigenous ways in which people teach, research, tell stories, use the visual arts, etc., that are not traditionally part of a Western university. And I think that when we look at around our campuses and look at the naming and the statues, and we look at the symbols, they are a good indication of a university that might still be steeped in its history without moving into the current ethos with the rich cultural artifacts that also need to become part of that curation. So if one looks at the curriculum in terms of different access routes, then we have a chance to address the axiological, the values underpinning the curriculum. What are we shaping students for? What are we shaping them to be? Indeed, we understand the challenges of this, the future era that we find ourselves in, but we also have to find a way to bring everyone along. And part of this has to do with that cultural and social representation that the curriculum has to provide for students, not just to access, but to succeed. The curriculum, therefore, I think has quite an important role to play in the access pathway. And its relations to the research that we produce and we generate, it's an important one to explore and unpack, etc. I'm going to lean on a framework that I use in terms of understanding this a little bit better and just unpack for you some of the ways in which decoloniality and research and curriculum could possibly, explore to see how we could enable access further. This is an onto-epistemic framework. So it means it looks at the idea of the being, the self. So who is the student? Who is the teacher? Who's the subject being spoken about? What does the discipline gravitate towards, etc., etc. The epistemic has to do with how knowledge is generated and what the truth claims are around that particular discipline. So the framework looks at three domains, and these have to do with knowledge, being, and power. The decolonial scholars, especially in Latin America, that draw on this framework, and we have used this quite a lot in our scholarship in order to unpack what it means to bring these into some sort of conversation with each other. So as I said earlier, coloniality is a departure point, and much of the work in decoloniality is to actually, interrogate, if you like, what are some of the systems that no longer serve us, and can we de-link from the kind of disciplines that we've been disciplined into? That is not to say that we cannot take the best of what disciplines offer, but we need to rethink the ways in which they limit and box us into particular ways of looking without looking wider and broader for a wider system of knowledge interventions. So the first one is decoloniality of knowledge. That's the focus. And here we're looking at three basic concepts, and this has to do with epistemic power, epistemic disobedience, and epistemic injustice. These have been written about extensively by many scholars and have been drawn on by many practitioners in this field. So epistemic power is to just assert what the current Western centric notions of curriculum do, how they maintain ideological power, and what this means for people on the margins. Epistemic disobedience is a concept to talk about what it means to change some of those conventions and to offer alternatives. And with good rationale and good justification, how can we be disobedient with care in terms of stretching those knowledges further? Miranda Fricker speaks very well about epistemic injustice in terms of testimonial and hermeneutical, and this is really very important to look at how research subjects, research participants, etc., are represented through markers of difference, such as gender, race, ethnicity, voice, accent, etc., and what this means for the testimonies that they give, and what this means for groups reading them and reading from them, and reinforcing the stereotypes around these cultural understandings. The second part of the framework has to do with the decoloniality of power. The scholars would define power as related to material resources. I'm using it to talk about research itself, the methodologies, funding, interventions, what kinds of topics are we researching? Are we asking the sort of, the right questions, if you like? Are we looking for solutions that are very localized, contextualized, but have global reach, that countries and contexts can actually think with the people, right, with the context, in order to come up with a response. And this has to do with taking back power. So if we're looking at structural power, even if it's cultural power, we're looking at relocating and making the locus of enunciation, the place from where we speak, centered in the places that we research, in the people that we work with. And through these processes and changing the kinds of research practices, we then give voice to those who have been marginalized and then make them part of the greater curriculum discussion. Hence, this is another way of providing access to postgrad students, to students in research projects, etc., to reconsider some of those traditional ways and what would opening those up mean. The third frame has to do with the decoloniality of being. In South Africa, in the Global South, we've spent a lot of time since 2016, when the students protested against the coloniality of the university. We spent a lot of time thinking about what it means to be an African. What does it mean to be a woman in this context? A man. What does it mean to be culturally bound by certain traditions? What does it mean to juggle an identity that has to do with living in rural and urban at the same time, in the city and in the township at the same time? And the emotional labor on the sense of being if one has to perform in different identities at the university. So a lot has been surfaced around, for example, hair, skin lightening. People are owning, in a sense, owning their sense of being, their heritage, who they are, and reclaiming, these as important aspects of their sense of self. So if we think about how power, knowledge, and being come together in that intersection, we can possibly think about this in terms of the curriculum and the programs that we lead, the content that we teach, the disciplines and their historicity. And we can try to redress and pay attention to these moments where the curriculum has a blind spot or is not actively addressing the sense of inclusion. And here again is where I think that decoloniality has a lot to offer. So I'd like to end there by saying that perhaps 3 ways that we can think about how the research focus of the World Universities Network program could possibly look at access and curriculum. is through the issue of ontological density. So we're talking about the richness, the nuance, not the one-dimensional view of any one person or all persons, but what is it that goes into that being, and take the time to really explore these in terms of how we present our research methods, research subjects, participants, etc. The second idea is epistemic plurality, and the idea of extending the range of knowledges, whether indigenous, traditional, conventional, scientific, social science, that in an interdisciplinary sort of conversation, what would these disciplines have to say to each other, with each other? What would they borrow from each other? What would they learn from each other? And the last one is the methodological integrity, that we create methods of doing research that really uphold the integrity of the person, of the knowledge they bring, of their values and beliefs. And I think that I have great hope that, in different fora, internationally, locally, if we start chipping away at this in community with our peers, colleagues, and students, we have a chance to make a difference. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bahari Leek, and thank you for correcting that title. Much appreciated, and many congratulations for that recent appointment. We will next turn to Jose Escamilla. He is the Associate Director of the Institute for the Future of Education at Tec de Monterey. The purpose of the Institute is to generate, transfer, and disseminate applicable knowledge on educational innovation, connecting, inspiring, and accompanying those who seek disruptive solutions for the future of higher education and lifelong learning. He was the Director of Tech Labs, Dean of the Graduate School of Education, and Director of Educational Innovation at Tec de Monterey. He has worked on the use of technologies in education, artificial intelligence, online education, and various educational innovation projects. He is a computer systems engineer from Tec de Monterey and has a master's and doctorate in AI from the Polytechnic Institute of Grenoble. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. Thanks for having me, and good morning for the people that are seeing in other places in the world. I'm very happy to be here as Associate Director of the Institute for the Future of Education. Let me tell you a couple of things about the Institute that I think are related to the subject I will talk about, that is addressing digital inequalities in higher education. So we have a dream and a purpose. You already tell us the purpose, Jane, but the dream is to reach to construct this future of higher education and lifelong learning to improve the lives of millions of people. And we believe that applying a framework such as this one, the 4 key themes, we call it FAIR. So education has to be fair, is a way of achieving that dream. Education has to be fit for purpose, so offering adequate technology and learning methodologies for different people, different students. Has to be accessible to cater to the needs of students in different contexts and needs. Inclusive for higher education and lifelong learners, trying to reach the ideal of universal access to all the population, and relevant and responsive to the needs of the industry and society. So as you see, accessibility and inclusiveness are at the heart of what we do in the Institute. So I have to have my computer here because it's not, okay. Let's go back, okay, here. So now let's talk about technology in higher education. So why technology is important, and I think we all know it, but it's important to talk about that. Technology is an essential component of the future of higher education for different reasons. So the first one of them is because it enables access and inclusion to other people through hybrid and online education. 2 of the themes that we have in the Institute. And it also enables the creation of educational methodologies and models that would otherwise will be impossible to achieve or difficult to create without technology. No? It should be to create without technology. It's not correctly written. Then I give 2 examples. So when you have a learning analytics system that is able to determine that someone is in risk of failing a course or dropping out, and the way that is done is not obvious to the human mind, no? So that the person is doing well, but it happens 3 semesters before, it has a 7 over 10, and it's coming from a certain background, maybe a particular high school. You can predict the possibilities of that person to fail, and it's not obvious for faculty. Then you can do things that otherwise will be impossible to do without technology, offering help and support to that student. And also things that you do with technology for learning, and an example will be augmented reality, where you can, for instance, teach how to understand how particular equation can be represented in the space, no? So you can have that kind of representation, and that you will not do that otherwise if you don't have that access to that technology, or not easily, no? So that's why technology is very important for higher education. During the pandemic, we realized that we had this gap of access to the internet. It was there all the time, but we weren't talking a lot about that. We can see how all countries, particularly middle-income and low-income countries, grew a lot. So I think you cannot read the graph, but at the top you have the developed countries or more rich countries in black. Then in blue you have the average of the world. Then in gray you have the average for middle-income countries, developing countries. And in red you have least developed countries. So you can see also how it grew during the pandemic, access to internet to different people, particularly in middle and low-income countries. And when we talk about the digital inequalities, many people think of this, no? This graph, which is just internet access. But that does not necessarily the whole definition of digital inequalities. I am referring here to a particular definition of OECD. Digital inequalities refer to difference in the material, cultural, and cognitive resources required to make good use of information and communication technology. So it's not only the material part, the software part, but also cultural and cognitive resources. So in order to work and reduce digital inequalities, we need to have actions for digital equality, no? So it's the opposite. So here I give an example or a definition that I think is more holistic than the regular ones. The first one is you have to provide access to internet-connected devices. That means not only to measure the access to internet, but access to robust broadband and continuous broadband over a period of time. And also not only a device like a cell phone that many times is used as a measure of that, but a computer or a laptop where you can really work for studying, no? For learning. Then a second one that is disregarded is digital skills for students and teachers. So we have the basic digital skills that allow you to find information, decide if the information is relevant or not, etc. But you also need digital learning skills for students. So learning how to learn using technology is not obvious. So when you get into a classroom, you know how to do it. But when you get into an online course, people doesn't know exactly how to behave in an online course. And also for the faculty, teaching skills, digital teaching skills for them. There's also the need in universities to have a proper infrastructure, technical support, resources like registering, accessing the library, etc. And also developing engaging online activities and content. Not only content that is online, but that is engaging for the student. And then last and less obvious is for those, what is, I think, paradoxical, no? Because we always think of online and hybrid learning as a silver bullet for vulnerable groups or groups that are not well represented. But those kind of students are the ones that struggle the most in online learning, because they don't have the cultural and social capital around them to do that. So it's necessary to create a network, and it can be created through friends, family, and other people from the university, of support for those students so that they have access to this capital and can relate to other people, ask for questions, and also understanding when they're struggling. So that is a very important part of support. A group of researchers of the Institute for the Future of Education made a literature review on digital inclusion. They use two databases, Scopus and Web of Science, and they found from 2000 to 2021, a total, after eliminating duplicate articles and non-peer review articles, etc., that there were only 158 peer review articles on the subject when you relate that to the digital gap to gender, age, ethnicity, disability, low-income, medium-income countries. So there's very little research in these areas, you will agree. And there's also underrepresentation of the countries, of researchers from the countries most in need of this kind of research. So there were only around 42 articles of authors that were coming from Latin America, Africa, or Asia, or co-authors with people from other countries. So most of the research is coming from the European Union, where Spain is one of the countries publishing the most in this, and also the United States and some Asian developed and underdeveloped countries. So my final slide is what WUN could do. I think there are a lot of things that we could do. The first one is to encourage in a network in our universities research in digital inequalities, particularly in middle and low income countries. That's where the problem is bigger. And also including explicitly these populations that are most excluded by older people, women, some ethnicities, and people with disabilities. Also foster collaboration between researchers to build a more holistic vision of this issue in underrepresented contexts and regions. So working together with people, universities, and other actors from these regions or these groups, letting them lead the research and co-working with them. And the last one is focus on applied research, not only in understanding the problems, but also on how we can reduce the problem. So, for instance, funding projects for rapid response and long-term policy solutions. An example will be advocating for internet as a human right, access to internet as a human right. Higher education institutions can bridge also between government and the private sector to give more access to internet equipment in our different countries. To create communities of practice with universities and other stakeholders around this. Something good that happened during the pandemic is that many people in networks started to work together to understand what were the good practices, what to do. So fostering the creation or maintenance of these communities of practice with this objective of reducing digital inequalities in this kind of contexts and contexts is very important. And last could be also another type of applied research is developing open access public goods and services for universities and other actors in these countries, like training, materials, guides, etc., that can be used and reused for other people. Thank you.
Thank you very much for talking with us about digital inequalities in higher education. Finally, we have Gian Mario Bassana, who is Associate Provost for Global Engagement and Online Learning at DePaul University. Under Gian Mario's leadership, DePaul created an institution-wide virtual exchange initiative called the Global Learning Experience. I assume it goes by GLE. that generated more than 250 projects implemented with partners in more than 30 countries. GLE was awarded a NAFSA Senator Paul Simon Spotlight Award for Campus Internationalization in 2020. John Mario holds a PhD in maths from the University of Notre Dame. He currently serves on the AIEA board as a member at large and represents DePaul on the steering committee of the International Virtual Exchange Conference. He's going to speak with us on equity in global learning, the role of virtual exchange.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you, everybody. I have this honor of being the last speaker, so bear with me. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here, particularly in a panel with somebody from Mexico, Australia, and South Africa that are all countries where virtual global learning has been pursued relatively energetically. Just for context, I'm that one thing that is not like the others in this crowd. I work at DePaul University, who's a large Catholic urban institution, 22,000 students, 60% of which are undergraduates, a vast majority of which are first-generation college students coming from the lower strata of the socioeconomic ladder, and good percentage of which are coming from the Chicago public school system. So we are by mission and by DNA about access and social mobility. That's what we do. So what I will try to do is to highlight the potential of virtual global learning and virtual exchange in particular to increase access, and also share a couple of what I think are the main challenges, particularly for university leadership on the road to the actualization of the potential of virtual global learning and virtual exchange. So I have this lens on access, which is global learning and its virtualization. Now, each of the institutions in this group thinks and defines global learning in different ways, with different emphasis and characteristics, as it should be. We've heard this need of localizing and customizing everything that we're talking about here today, because you have to match your mission and ethos. So in order to concretize in your situation, what I'm going to talk about today, you need to do this little bit of a imagination work. Possibly some of the things I will say won't make sense in your context, that's okay. But if you have to find the right color and flavor for the things to make sense, please do so. I'm going to repeat some of the things that have been said earlier today, at least twice, but with a little preface. Hans de Wit and Philip Altbach, who are two very well-known scholars of international education, right before the pandemic published an article with a very strong statement, and I'm going to quote, "Internationalization has to make the shift from being mobility-driven and elitist to targeting all students through curriculum development and an intensive use of technology." This was a really strong statement, but that reflects the reality of what we heard earlier today. We heard the estimates that UNESCO estimates the global higher education population to be 250 million in 2020, estimated to grow to 377 million by 2030, and then we learned this morning from Ellen and Jane just reminded us of that by 2040 we expect that population to be 660 million. At the same time, the globally mobile population that I defined as students who engage in some sort of cross-border higher education is estimated by Project Atlas to be roughly 5.5 million today, and estimated to grow to about 8 million by 2030. Ellen this morning optimistically said that that corresponds to a 2.6% of globally mobile students. I think it's lower than that. If you do the math, it's like 2 point something, not as high as 2.6. So a really, really small percentage. Now, no one here, and I'm not advocating to abandon traditional mobility, which continues to offer extraordinary life-changing experiences to our students. But my point here is that there is a strategic synergy between virtual forms of global learning, virtual exchange in particular, on one hand, and traditional mobility on the other. And I would encourage all of us to fight the various attempts to create narratives of conflict an opposition between virtual forms of global learning and traditional mobility. That said, going back to Hans and Philip's statement, traditional mobility can no longer be the primary modality in which global learning, whichever flavor of global learning you think about in your institution, is implemented in our university. So availability, affordability, reliability, and approachability of many synchronous web-based conferencing tools have forever decoupled synchronicity and co-location of learning experiences, meaning we no longer need to be all in the same physical space at the same time in order to be able to interact, learn, and do research together with all the due attention to what we just heard from our colleague from tech about digital inequalities. But still, this decoupling is a reality. So virtual global learning in its many forms, and virtual exchange in particular, are very well positioned, I think, to leverage this epochal change and to respond to Hans and Philip's provocation. So the pandemic has brought many institutions to adopt forms of virtual global learning as an expedient measure to face the impossibility of physical travel. But I think it's time to move from expediency to strategy, and that's what I'm going to try to advocate for right now. So the virtual exchange community has a language problem, because if we took a pause, the clock is running, so I can't really do that, but if any of us try to describe what we think when somebody says virtual exchange, we will probably have 40 different versions of what this thing is. So I'm going to try to say what I think it is and what I'm trying to talk about today to narrow the field a little bit. So we're talking about our carefully designed learning experiences, intentionally co-designed by two professors, by two academics in two different institutions in two different parts of the world, in which, and this is key, students work collaboratively on projects with very clearly defined learning outcomes in an intentionally, carefully designed intercultural framework. So I am not talking about Sydney students taking online courses at DePaul, and on an exchange basis, DePaul students taking online courses at Sydney. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking me and Jane sitting down and working very carefully on the structure of a project that then our students will work on together. And just to clear up further misunderstanding, I am not talking about online classes. My professors do virtual exchange in-person, in-class classes. My professor teach a class of real students, not that the virtual students are real, but students in the room, but the collaboration with the students in India or in Turkey happens outside of class, as part of the syllabus, obviously technology facilitated, but the class itself continues in the same way in person. We do virtual exchange in online classes too, but that's not the key of the idea here. A couple of examples. Students in Chicago and in Pune, India learn and compare about the impact of systemic racism and discrimination on the supply chain of food production and distribution and the reality of food deserts. And the final project here is strategies for community organizations for possible interventions. Simple example. Students in Chicago and in Sao Paulo work jointly on a marketing plan for a business of their choice to penetrate a third international market. Another simple example. So these virtual exchange projects are always embedded in existing classes. We don't invent new courses for these projects. My marketing professor teaches international marketing. She's been teaching it for 20 years, but now she does a virtual exchange project with UNESCO in Brazil inside the same course. Typically, they last 6 to 8 weeks. In some cases, they can be longer, depending on the agreement between the two academics. And if you think about it, these experiences lead students to achieve learning outcomes on 3 levels. Content, because they're learning always about something, or they're learning or doing research about something. intercultural competence, because it's built in the framework of the experience, and virtual global collaboration skills. And this is the area in which virtual exchange brings added value compared to other traditional forms of global learning. As the world moves to multiple modalities of working and learning, we've experienced them here these couple of days, with a mixture of in-person and virtual, new skills are needed for our graduates. This ability to handle time differences, language differences, cultural differences in a virtual, collaborative environment. We've all experienced these issues in the past 2 years. These are, on one hand, worthy skills by themselves in an absolute sense, but they're also very much, the acquisition of these skills is very much targeted towards giving our graduates more employability potential. We are trying to do a longitudinal studies on the impact on employability of these projects, and I don't have enough data yet to present. Right now, we only have anecdotal evidence, but we keep hearing now from students who have been in virtual exchange that they go to job interviews and the smart interviewer spots on their CVs these projects, and then they start digging and they ask questions. And if the students are clever enough to be able to really spin a good narrative around these experiences, then they immediately have an advantage. So to circle back to DeWitt and Altbach, virtual exchange allows us to open the doors of transformational international experiences to a much larger group of students who traditionally have not been globally mobile. Students in underrepresented groups, students who work and cannot afford the income lost to go abroad, non-traditional students, first-generation college students, and many more. Add the whatever class of underrepresented students you have in your own institution. I was having a conversation at lunch with a couple of people. I'm not advocating for creating a second-class study abroad experience. Okay? Oh, I'm sorry, you don't have the money to go to Cambridge next semester. Here's the poor cousin version of international education, do virtual exchange. That's not what I'm advocating here for. I'm advocating developing clear narrative around the learning outcomes that are different, that can be achieved either through traditional mobility or through virtual exchange. And then present the various options as part of your portfolio of global learning opportunities within your institution. Virtual exchange is, in all implementation I know, free for students, no added fees. I don't know of any institutions in the community of virtual exchange practitioners that imposes extra fees to students. But it's not free for institutions. An analysis that we did at DePaul and in conversation with other institutions points to the fact that virtual exchange cost is between 1/3 and 1/2 of the cost of study abroad, if you factor in everything, staff and everything. So virtual exchange can increase access and equity, offers a rich set of learning outcomes, is environmentally sustainable, I had mentioned that earlier, but obviously, right? And costs half of traditional mobility. Sounds almost too good to be true, right? The promise of increased access the virtual exchange offers can be realized only, and here's my challenge to you, if institutions commit to implement virtual exchange at scale. This cannot be a vanity project that you do with 2 of your professors so that you can say that your institution does it and check that box and make your president happy and your board happy, right? I mean, you can do that, fine, but you're not really targeting access. You need to do it. It needs to be done at scale. So what needs to happen to make this really take off? Yesterday, I had similar conversation with the senior international officers in the other group. We went a little bit more in details about what's necessary, what the pieces of the puzzles are. I don't have time in the 1 minute and 1 second that I have left to go through all of that. Feel free to reach out to me. I'm always happy to show you how the pieces of the puzzle came together for us. I just want to add one final word on another aspect of increased access that virtual exchange can offer, not just for your student populations, but also in terms of geographic reach of the type of partners that you can involve in these projects. DePaul did not have any physical mobility opportunity or joint research partnership with institutions in Georgia or in Nigeria. Now we have 2, soon to be 3 sets of stable, repeated virtual exchange projects with institutions in both countries, in Nigeria and in Georgia. I have 10 seconds, but it's a previous speaker's fault because my original script ended here, but this morning a few things kind of provoked me, so I'm going to add a couple thoughts. So this morning, our colleague from the University of Bergen spoke about the need to change the traditional, and I think I try to quote verbatim, the academic praxis of the North and South partnership. And he also spoke about the dangers of the use of language as a colonial weapon. I think the virtual exchange has already emerged as an effective disruptor in both of these areas. And the proof of this is this extraordinary explosion of virtual exchange in Latin America. There's now plenty of South-to-South virtual exchange activity. Chile with Venezuela, Ecuador with Argentina. In Spanish, language is no longer the, English is no longer the language of power. Spanish is emerging as a dominant language for collaborations in virtual exchange, which I think it's terrific. One very last thing, if I can find the page. So in this 2 days here, as the kind of the thing that doesn't fit with the rest, I heard a lot you guys talking about a very genuine and passionate desire and commitment to continue to develop equitable and inclusive environments, particularly for PhD students, to conduct research in an across, still possibly north-south, but in an equitable way. And I invite you to really think about virtual exchange for your undergraduates as a way to plant seeds for access, equity, inclusion, multicultural sensitivities for your future PhD students. You can't imagine that a PhD student thrown into a situation of imbalance of power, language, and dynamics all of a sudden miraculously learns how to, on top of having to do the experiments and the data crunching, miraculously learns how to be multiculturally sensitive and absorb the ethos that you want to absorb, right? These short virtual exchange experiences prepare the students, I hope that we'll be preparing undergraduates and then we'll come to your institutions and become successful researchers and future academics. So in conclusion, virtual exchange is a powerful pedagogical tool that can significantly increase access to global learning, but needs to be implemented at scale as part of a well thought out and supported strategy. Looking forward to more conversations, and please reach out to me if you want to learn more.
Thank you very much, John Mario. I'd like to invite all the speakers to come up and sit in the comfy chairs, and we can take some questions from the audience. We've had a lot to think about, especially related to frame shifting, narrative shifting, and epistemic reframing, and forming new ontologies of learning. Please. Any initial questions? No, it's not.
I have a question for Andrew.
Sure.
Do the recent elections change the landscape for you? Are quotas going to be reinstated? Or?
Maybe. Look, Australia's been very lucky. We've grown our higher education system, university system in particular, significantly over 10 years. I don't think it's about growth. I think that a lot of the issues will be around the sort of social agendas, economic agendas in terms of industry transformation post-COVID and things like that, which put the university sector front of the frame for that sort of social cohesion and so forth of the community. So I think it's a different agenda now with a change in government. Do I think anything will fundamentally shift in the way in which we've funded, the amount of funding we've got? Not in the next couple of years. There's lots of other challenges that Australia has to deal with. But I think universities will probably have a better opportunity to put their case forward in terms of what we can do to impact on the community. And at the same time, re-bring to the fore the issues that we've been talking about today. Because if you're not in a conversation, which frankly we haven't particularly been in a conversation for the past several years, but if you're back in the conversation, you have the opportunity to start to say, well, how can we address these other issues too? So I think that's the asset that we will have now for the next couple of years. Time will tell.
Well, I have a question about that links some of what Ellen Hazelcorn talked about earlier, and that there being higher education historically has been the province of the elite. And it has historically served as a sorting mechanism within society. And rankings reinforce that. And some of our own metrics that we use to measure ourselves reinforce that. In the US, we often look at selectivity as an indicator. That to me is a perverse indicator of quality, because it suggests that you only pick the top and then you educate only the top. I'm wondering, in thinking about all of what has been discussed just now in reframing education, how should the WUN think about some of this reframing that we're talking about, and really begin to approach it as a network? Do we have the appetite for that? And is technology a solution? And I really appreciate your comments that technology is one piece of a multi-pronged solution. So I'm wondering what the speakers and perhaps what others in the audience might think about this.
So, I will not say I'm an expert on the field of including students of all different backgrounds in the university, but one of the things that we have done very successfully is explicitly including students of the lower income or from the pyramid in the university. And one of the things is that there are students that are already very good students, but they don't think they are Tech of the Monterey material. Also, we offer them scholarships, full tuition, dorms, etc. But they don't come because they don't think they could be Tech of the Monterey material. So it's another type of exclusion, because they feel that they don't belong, no, to Tech de Monterrey. So you have to go and find them because they will not come easily. So we use different kinds of networks and visits to go and find those students. And I think that the word is spreading, because it's becoming more and more the number of students that come. But unfortunately, we have not enough of those scholarships, because we are growing our endowment to have a bigger amount for those students. I think we have around 700 students of that type. So the technology could be also a way of improving access, and we have done mainly in the master's degree, offering online programs. One of the groups that we have offer online programs is for K-12 teachers that normally come from other backgrounds. They don't, in Mexico, not all of them did a regular university, they did a normal school. So we have done some a different way of framing that, and also as they are not aware of technology, we have developed a lot of tools to make them more comfortable with technology and understanding how they can succeed in the university.
I think the answer, the question about are we just serving an elite part of society as I wouldn't describe UTS as an elite institution. I'd like to be a prestigious institution, one that's well regarded. For Australia, I think, and again, I'm speaking particularly from my context, it's not about getting more people for the sake of getting more people through university. The reality is the jobs of the future are going to need these skills. So it's about a social mobility to close the gap. We recently celebrated an unemployment rate of 3.9%, which is, I don't know, John, how many years has it been since we've been that sort of number? Forever. But it hides and masks a significant youth unemployment. And that's where the education sector has failed us, and that's where the issue of access and setting up the mechanism for people to engage. So it's not about putting more people into elite law school programs or something. It's actually basically getting them to even play in the modern economy.
Yes, please.
Oh, sorry, I'm about to change the topic a bit. And I'm not sure if this is a question or if it's just a comment. It's probably going to end up being a comment at the end. I agree with what has been said earlier in terms of when you improve access to higher education, you also have to look at the experiences of students within the system, including the need to decolonize the system. And what has happened in Canada lately for the medical profession, for Black students, is the consequences of increasing access to higher education. So what has happened, a trend across the country has been the implementation of pathways for Black students to be able to get into medical schools in Canada. And we have that also in some universities, including our universities, for Indigenous students. Well, it's great. The only thing is oftentimes we only think about the first step. We don't think about what the consequences of that are. So what is happening now? So for example, I have a project I'm doing on mental health of Black youths. I invited people to apply. I got 150 applications from Black youths. They're now trying to get into med school. So it does have consequences. But then what we are looking at now is we are seeing more and more discussions about the experiences of Blacks in residency programs. Because of course, they've gotten in. Now, we are now talking about the experiences and issues related to systemic racism within residency programs. So as we are talking about access to higher education, we should also be talking about, the experiences in undergraduate programs and also how to position them too for graduate studies. So that then, it's not just disparities. It's not just that we are addressing disparities at the lower level of the academic hierarchy, but then we're also getting them to much higher PhD levels.
Thank you. I like how that comment links with Dr. Bahari Leek's reframing and pieces. Is there anything you want to offer?
Yes, Jane, I thought that would be a good point for me to come in. Thank you so much. I think it's very interesting that we speak about the massification of higher education, and at the same time, we talk about it being an elite sector. So that's a conundrum I think we need to really reflect on. So while we might be elite in terms of who's accessing, it's important that our interventions don't make higher education elitist. And so through the curriculum and our pedagogies, that we are not speaking to a chosen few who then manage to move up the pyramid, as we say, and then become very successful at the expense of others. So in the rush to social mobility, economic mobility, and in terms of the job skills, I think we have to take a both-and approach. Pedagogy before technology, pedagogy with technology. What does pedagogy mean? It means looking at the curriculum. So while we're looking at new curricular components like robotics and drones and all sorts of things that make us forward-looking and entrepreneurial, we also have to face the reality that a lot of the world is still grappling with a lot of issues that can't be solved through technology alone. So it's that academic social sort of tension, both and, that we have to hold, not one or the other. How to do that is very difficult because traditionally we've pulled in different directions. So what is it going to take for administrators, for teachers, for technologists to think with both sides of the brain?
Thank you. Yes. And John Mario.
Yeah, I want to make a comment on the comment that Bukola made, which I think is very apropos. Access is not just tweaking, it's also that, tweaking the parameters to make sure that you have the pipeline of the diverse students, but in our case, it starts way before that with the regular contact with the Chicago Public Schools, because you need to have that ability to communicate that, yes, it is reachable, yes, can be within your horizon to get to in our case, to DePaul University and get a bachelor's degree. We have a program with the Chicago Housing Authority that every summer we go to the projects, the popular housing installments that are part of the segregated nature of Chicago, and we recruit young women to come to campus during the summer for a film and documentary filmmaking intensive course in which they can tell their stories as women growing up in the projects. They have a ball, they have the ability to use state-of-the-art equipment, they see what university life can be, and that's a drop in the bucket, right? But it starts there, and then everything else you said, residence life, and having the support system in place, because it's not just about bringing them in.
Can I add another comment as well? Because I think it's worth keeping in mind. I appreciate the comment very much that we have to focus on what we do, and things like targets and so forth and strategies. In some ways, they're a means to an end. They're not an end in themselves. So what do you want out of some of these things? So we in engineering, for example, we might really celebrate that we get the 30% women in engineering, but the benefit is that the profession values from the diversity that comes from that. The profession starts to be more inclusive around decision making in an extremely complicated environment where you're not just making technical decisions anymore. If you think about what we do in terms of, and I don't think it's the same issue that we're talking about around decolonisation, but we've introduced within all of our courses in the university what we call Indigenous graduate attributes, so that all of our students understand what it means in their profession to work with Indigenous people and for Indigenous people. And again, the objective is not the target to get 3% Indigenous people. The target is that as a collective graduate population, a deeper understanding of the cultural barriers that exist for Indigenous peoples, and to make a difference in the world. So I think we should never take our eye off of the ultimate outcome and keep testing the outcome. Is it going to achieve what we want to achieve? And then work back to the strategy, the target, and so forth.
Thank you. In the back, yes.
It's a question for Andrew particularly, I guess, but I'd be interested in the other panellists' views. So there was some research quite recently in Australia which effectively tried to take a quantitative approach to the costs of teaching what are called low SES students, so that's people from the most disadvantaged quartile of the community, essentially. It found that for postgraduates, it cost 4 times as much to teach these people, and for undergraduates, 6 times as much. That's obviously an Australian context, but I imagine it's probably quite similar in other countries. And the researchers proposed various mechanisms to basically reflect this in the funding. So find ways of essentially giving 6 as much times as subsidy and fee, whatever the funding mechanism is, for a disadvantaged undergraduate. So a completely wholesale reshuffling of the way teaching is funded in Australia. I mean, Andrew, I think you were saying you need to do something controversial to shift these recalcitrant, completely immobile equity performance rates. Would you support something along those lines? And I'll be interested in other panellists as well.
Look, I think it's an interesting concept. I've done many of these exercises of trying to identify the costing and the drivers and so forth to try to get a particular outcome. And I'd have to say it's very complicated. So it's hard to work out what number it should be. But it should be something, right? Because I mentioned it in passing, when the demand-driven system came into play, and the intention was to get more low SES students in higher education, there was a recognition that it cost more. And so there was a funding scheme put in place which would be awarded to universities on the basis of their performance in participation of low socioeconomic students. It was called the Higher Education Participation and Partnership Programme. It had existed in various forms in the past, but it was purposed towards the end. So it recognised that there was a cost. I think something like that does work, where it's linked to the outcome. I think if you try to do it the other way around and link it to the input on the basis of some assumptions you make, you end up becoming so disconnected that the system becomes bogged down with a really very, very distorted funding mechanism. Where do you stop? We've had a long debate in Australia about funding of different disciplines, funding education, the cost of education. Unlike the UK system, which is flat, we fund according to discipline clusters. So the government, if you're a law student, the government puts $1,000 or so in and the student pays $15,000. If you're an engineering student, the government puts in, maybe it's $18,000 and the student puts in 10, something like that. How do you work that stuff out? And then how do you work it out with all the other things? So two answers to the question. One is some incentive that recognises the cost, but equally I think it has to reflect institutional commitment and not system commitment, because we've demonstrated that the system doesn't work.
Something related to that, last 3 weeks ago, the World Bank presented in our campus a study in Latin America of short cycle university programs. In Mexico, those universities are called technological or polytechnical university that offer the 2 or 3 year degree programs, and that's it. No, they don't have more than that. So one of the inequalities is the funding. So those students, normally those universities cater to students of low-income families that also some of them work, have a family already, and they go part-time. What they do is study and work. But the funding is disproportionate compared to other public-funded universities. So not every public university is funded the same. I think there are political issues and historical issues because of that. But in particular, this sector that has the students that need the most support are really underfunded. So it's another way of not providing good access to quality education to these groups.
Thank you very much. This panel has really, I think, provided a lot of nuance into a very complex and complicated issue. Dr. Bahari Leek's framing and focus on importance of reframing to create new forms of knowledge and always being aware of the frame, I think creates a useful theoretical context for us to understand the more applied spaces that we've heard about from our other speakers. So I hope you'll join me in thanking our speakers. I think we're at time.
Thank you, Jane, and the panel, and indeed thank you to all the speakers today, and the moderators who chaired the sessions for what, for me at least, has been a very illuminating day. Thank you all for joining us, particularly those of you who were with us through the online connection and streamed with us all day. I know what it's like to stay on Zoom all day, so thank you all for being with us. One final note, some of you will be staying until tomorrow. For any of you who would like to join an informal group for dinner this evening, meet in the lobby of the hotel at 7 o'clock. Mike, is there anything else I've missed? Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you next year in Monterey. Thank you.
So I had the chance to open the meeting on Sunday, and I have the chance to close it again. So I thanked everybody yesterday. I'm going to do it again. The WUN team for choosing Lausanne to come here and then organizing the meeting. Of course, again, the International Relations Office and the team and the students who have been part of that. And then just want to add that there's still some drinks and cocktail organized at the castle of the university, so you're welcome to join us just here. And thank you all, and I wish you had a very good time here in Lausanne, and you are welcome back anytime you want. Okay, thanks.